My name is Affaf Noor. I'm one of the expert tutors for Advanced Auditor Assurance. The video you're about to watch is on ethics, a topic which can be tested in Section A or Section B of the AAA exam. So it could be a part of the case study or it could be a part of one of the two questions in Section B, the 25-mark questions. We are going to focus on understanding the answering techniques. We'll look at examples from the past exams so that you can know how to apply the knowledge that you have. I will also talk about the format that you need to follow to ensure that you get the professional skills marks. And I will be talking about the best way for learning the code, because ethics is one of those rare topics that need to be learned before you can actually apply them to a given scenario.
We'll start off with the checklist of topics that you should be comfortable with. We'll then discuss the common reasons for not being able to attempt questions on ethics well in the exam. I'll show you examples of how the answer to an ethics question should be attempted in the exam. I will also recommend an approach to prepare this topic because, like I said earlier, there is some learning involved in this topic of the AAA exam. We'll then look at the answering technique using examples from past exams. Following the answering techniques will help you manage your time in the exam and get you the available technical and professional skills marks. With reference to the syllabus guide, you should be able to evaluate and respond to threats to compliance with fundamental principles of ethics. This should include your ability to evaluate the effectiveness of available safeguards for different situations given in the exam question. The best place to revise this is Chapter 3 of ACCA's Study Hub. You can read through the content to understand and learn the technical knowledge that needs to be applied to the AAA exam questions. Please remember that complete understanding of ISPA's Code of Ethics and ACCA's Code of Ethics and Conduct is important, because without that knowledge, you would not be able to evaluate the threats or the issues that are given in the exam. In the exam, you may be required to evaluate ethical and professional issues for a given scenario. It really doesn't get any more complicated than that. Please remember, this is the same code of ethics that you would have studied in audit and assurance, and in advanced audit and assurance, you just need to ensure that you have sound knowledge of the fundamental principles, the threats to these principles and potential safeguards, because the lack of knowledge of code is a common reason for failing questions on ethics. As you have to demonstrate your ability to apply your knowledge to the scenario, inability to evaluate threats and determine appropriate safeguards is another reason why you might struggle with attempting these questions. Having said that, once you've watched this video and noted down the answering technique, you should be comfortable with these requirements when they come up. Ethics is one of those rare topics in AAA where there is a certain level of learning expected. If you don't know what the code says, you won't be able to apply it to the scenario. As mentioned earlier, Chapter 3 of ACCA's Study Hub covers the knowledge that you need to be comfortable with. I normally recommend that you summarize these guidelines in a way that suits your learning style. It could be a flow chart or it could be a table as shown on the screen. So just using this as an example, in an exam question, once you've identified that an audit client has asked for temporary staff, you can then evaluate the scenario based on this summary that you would have made and learned. You'll explain how the threats in the first column arise. Simply writing self-review, familiarity, advocacy, management threat is not going to suffice at all. Make sure you explain them. As for the next steps, because you haven't agreed to provide the temporary staff yet, it's the lower half of the second column that needs to be applied. So you need to ensure it is only for a short period of time, less than 6 months, for example, the staff doesn't assume management responsibilities, etc. And you'd be getting technical and professional skills marks when you talk about these safeguards. If you're studying with a friend, or in a group, you can divide chapter 3 of the study hub, summarize the threads and talk through them together, which will help you retain the knowledge that is required for this topic. We're now going to look at the answering technique. As always, you need to begin with reading the scenario super carefully, as marks are awarded for referring to the scenario or specific issues from it, not just stating knowledge of the code of ethics. You need to identify the ethical threat from the scenario. You then have to evaluate the threat. This basically means understand how the threat arises and discuss its implication. You will need to remember what the code says about this particular situation. You then need to apply the knowledge to the specific scenario to determine the safeguards or the course of action required. Sometimes the threat may be so significant that no safeguard would be possible, in which case you need to write that you would not be accepting or continuing with the engagement. We will now discuss each element of this technique through examples extracted from past exams. Let's start with a simple but a frequently tested example. Your audit client has asked you to prepare consolidated financial statements as an additional non-assurance engagement. Please remember, in the AAA exam, if the question does not state that it's a public or a listed company, you will assume it's private and apply the code accordingly. So the first part of the answering technique requires you to identify and explain threats. If you agree to prepare financial statements for an audit client, self-review and management threats may arise. Simply writing the names would not be awarded any marks. You need to explain that there's a self-review threat, as the auditor's judgment might be compromised if they over-rely on their own work, ultimately leading to the self-review threat. Similarly, there's a risk of assuming management responsibilities, as the auditor would be taking on decisions and responsibilities that basically belong to the management, which is preparation of your consolidated financial statements. So a student who would have written there's a self-review and a management threat would have gotten a 0. The mark is for explaining the threat, not just writing down the name. We now need to evaluate how significant the self-review and management threats are. The code states that the audit firm can only provide services related to the preparation of accounting records of financial statements to an audit client if those services are routine and mechanical. Routine and mechanical basically means there should be no judgment or management decision making. So the first part is me basically explaining to the markers or the examining team that I know what the code says about this. You now need to address the threat, which basically means you have to decide whether safeguards can be applied or should we simply say no. Preparing the group accounts is not going to be routine and mechanical. It would involve auditor making judgments and taking responsibility for the whole consolidated financial statements. This would also be perceived as taking on significant management responsibility, and therefore the firm should not accept this engagement. So you can see that as long as you remember what the code says, it's the application that will get you the marks in the exam. We'll look at 2 more examples where there's a bit more evaluation expected than this one. I want you to pause the video, read through the example carefully and highlight the key points. Your audit client has requested that your firm perform an additional service to carry out a detailed review of some of the company's internal controls and recommend improvements. They have said that they won't be paying any additional fee for this work, as external auditors are going to be testing controls anyway. The requirement is you have to evaluate any ethical and professional issues raised. Before we move on to coming up with a good answer that meets the examiner's expectations, Note that the requirement has an additional word, which is professional issues. There's no checklist that needs to be kept in mind. The examiner is basically stating that they'd give you marks for discussing any additional elements beyond the code of ethics that you want to talk about, because that might be an element that the firm needs to consider before they say a yes or a no to the engagement. Now, although this wasn't explicitly mentioned, you would have understood that the assignment the firm is being asked to carry out is similar to internal audit. So your evaluation needs to be based on the code's guidelines related to providing internal audit services to external audit clients. Please also note this is not a listed client. You need to explain that there's a self-review threat, as auditors would be assessing the effectiveness of internal controls during external audit as well, and therefore their judgment might be compromised if they do not recheck their work properly. This self-review threat can be safeguarded by making sure there are two separate engagement teams performing the external audit and the internal audit engagements. There's also a management threat, because we all know that designing and implementing controls is management's responsibility. As this is not a listed client, internal audit is not prohibited. We can apply safeguards to avoid management threat, which include getting the management to acknowledge that designing, implementing controls is their responsibility, that they'll approve the scope and frequency of the work, and they'll be the ones who decide which of the recommendations they're going to be implementing. So I explained self-review. I explained how self-review could be managed. I evaluated management threat and gave possible safeguards for managing your management threat. If you note, the client is being a bit cheeky because they want this work to be done without having to pay any additional fee. We therefore need to explain that this is an additional service which is separate from audit. There's going to be a separate engagement letter with separate fee, and that will get you your additional technical and professional skills marks. So overall, an effective evaluation of ethical and professional issues will help you manage your time. There's no extra effort that is needed to get the professional skills marks, as long as your evaluation is correct and your recommended course of action is appropriate. We're going to have a look at one more example before we wrap up. Okay, so this example is a bit of an odd one, which is why I've included this in the video. You're expected to apply your knowledge from international account auditing standards or international standards on auditing, as well as your code of ethics. So it's a combination of external audit knowledge along with your ethical code knowledge. The good news is that this basically means proper discussion will help you get lots of marks. Now, in their annual report, your audit client publishes financial KPIs like percentage change in revenue, as well as non-financial social and environmental key performance indicators like total staff days lost due to accidents at work. So remember, this is not a part of my financial statements. This is in the annual report. The finance director has asked if your firm can provide assurance on these KPIs as a part of performing the annual audit. So as a part of external audit. She has suggested that in order to pay for this extra work, the agreed audit fee will be increased by 20% as long as the assurance is favorable. So you're expected to evaluate any ethical and professional issues raised. When you're reading the question, some important elements should have been picked up. These KPIs will be published in the annual or integrated report along with the financial statements. This means this is other information that we as external auditors need to read through, and as a part of our statutory audit, we need to look for inconsistencies between this information and financial statements or my knowledge of the client. Secondly, they're trying to incentivize a favorable outcome by linking the fee to what our report would say, but this is not external audit. So this contingent fee element is not related to audit, it's related to assurance on the KPIs. So keeping these things in mind, we're going to start evaluating the threats. We know that there's a self-review threat, but we need to build up on that explanation, as simply writing self-review and not explaining it is going to be a waste of time and space. We'll begin with explaining how these KPIs are a part of other information that we'll be reading through. We'll then explain the self-review threat. The team performing the assurance work might not raise queries or highlight errors which they may have made during external audit when reading the other information. You can also discuss advocacy and self-interest threat here. In terms of safeguards, this can be done as long as an independent partner review is carried out for both the engagements, but for external audit in particular. Remember, a quality control review or an independent partner review has to be done by someone other than the engagement partner. Similar to what was discussed earlier, but a bit more complication involved, another issue that needs to be discussed is the fee. Number one, we cannot amend and increase the audit fee. Additionally, there's a contingent fee which can give rise to a self-interest threat. There's financial interest of the firm that they would want to give a good assurance opinion in order to get the money. Remember, contingent fee is a flat out no for external audit. Ideally, it shouldn't be used for any other assurance engagement either. Therefore, the most prudent course of action would be to get the client to understand that you will charge the fee on a non-contingent basis separate from the audit fee. Similar to what we discussed in the earlier example, this is an engagement which is separate from audit and should have a separate fee charged and confirmed in a separate engagement letter. You can also talk about the need to consider competence, resources and deadlines with a particular focus on competence and experience over here, because they're talking about sustainability that my firm might not be comfortable with. To wrap this all up, please ensure you've learned the code of ethics before you attempt the questions on the practice platform. Written practice, applying the techniques that we've discussed, will help you manage your time better in the exam and of course get more comfortable with questions on professional ethics.